Hello, it's been quite a week here. I was going to do this this morning for members, but I've just decided to kind of take a different tack. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cover Palantir, but basically, like from a 59-minute trader standpoint, which is what one of the courses that I teach, but it's kind of my premier course on day trading. And stay tuned at the end of this video because I'll talk about that a little bit more. But anyway, I want to show you the various kind of nuances of Palantir throughout the day. So this is what, and we've got, let's see, about 50 minutes, 50 before the close here. But I've seen what I needed to see, and I'm going to walk you through it. Okay, so this is a 1-minute chart here. And what I'm going to be doing is I will be changing to 5 to 10, whatever, throughout this video, which I have no idea how long it's going to be, but I know what I'm going to say. So Palantir had been absolutely taking it in the shorts here. Like this is what happened. Like this thing really just got gutted, over 15% in just a few days after after earnings were awesome, but they weren't awesome enough. And so today, though, the stock had gapped down below the 50-day moving average. And my sense was, in fact, I sent it out in the morning note. If you're a member, you know what I'm talking about. My sense was that we'd get some kind of a snapback rally. We get some kind of move back above the 50-day moving average because that's just what happens. We see a similar thing with Nvidia today. There are a few others that I'll go into in the strategy session today, but I just want to stick with Palantir now. So this was kind of a textbook move. Where you'd expect this kind of a reaction rally or a natural snapback, whatever you want to call it. But let's look at this as it looked in the morning here. Okay, so I'm going to get us back to, okay, so here, this is where we were yesterday afternoon. Bam. So this is where we closed, okay? Then today, we get a little snapback. It's a 1-minute chart, right? I wouldn't even call this a snapback. It's like somebody bought. And down here, stock fell and then starts rallying up. Okay, that's 1 minute. You don't do anything with that except watch it. And then the stock starts running up above here. Now, this orange line here is the volume weighted average price. And this is how this works. And by the way, this is a momentum indicator. Down is bad, flat is meh, and up is good. So we're on the upswing here, still negative here because we're in red, but at some point we're going to start turning green, which we've got here. So you kind of want to be biased to the upside if you're looking at trading this thing. But this yellow or orange line here is the volume weighted average price. And you can Google it if you want, but it's the average price by volume of all the shares traded. What's the average price? It had nothing to do with closing price. And so the idea is this. If the stock is above the volume weighted average price, that means there's buying pressure. If the stock is below the volume weighted average price, that means there's selling pressure. And it's just a function of math. As a stock can fall, and then every time it rebounds, if that turns out to be where the average price of by volume is on that day, then you know there's buyers because the stock bounces off of it. If the stock instead starts running up and then falls away from that volume weighted average price line, then you know that there's sellers. So this is actually a really clear thing. And that is, don't be long if the stock is below the VWAP. Don't be short if the stock is above the VWAP because you're going against the grain. Now, in very, very extreme cases, when a stock is really at an extreme low or an extreme high above or below the VWAP, then that's different. That's just simple trading. Oh man, this thing's stretched so far, I'm going to ride it back towards the average. That's not what I'm talking about here though. So again, we're 2 minutes into the day. Now, what I'm looking at here is, okay, we're rambling around up here. Now we're 4 minutes into the day. Nothing to do. It's just nothing to do here. I'm watching this line down here, and we're still nothing to do. So any idea, we're now how many minutes in? We're 8 minutes in, and any idea that this stock is going to bounce very much has to be thrown out the window. You cannot be looking at this stock as a long. You just can't do it. And so this keeps going. Now it starts rallying up to the upside. And where does it go? Couldn't even make it to the VWAP. And so we're still on a downtrend here. Now, all of this tells us there's no trades here, guys. There's no trades. So I'm not sitting here. I'm not going to tell you, oh, so you buy here and then you sell here and then you buy here. No, that's for somebody else. We don't do that. I just want to make money. I don't want to trade. I want to make money. And so there's nothing to do here. Now, we're almost half an hour in. Now we start to go above the VWAP, right? Okay, but here's where the 59-minute trade idea comes in. The first half an hour, maybe the first 40 minutes of every market day is what gives you a tenor for the stock, the tone for the stock, at least for the morning. The afternoon can be a little bit different. So you see this and say, oh, great, the selling's over. I'm in. That's fine, but you're still looking at a 1 minute chart. Not that much going on here. And sure enough, we're back down. So you buy here, you get shaken out. Now you're going, well, what the hell am I going to do here? Oh, I'm going to buy here because it's going up. You see what I mean? You can get wrapped around the axle so badly by just trying to trade the ebb and flow on this goofy ass stock that's $173. So let's say you catch it right at the bottom and now it's up at the VWAP. Congratulations, you've made 1.4% on a perfect trade, which I've never made one of those. But so now the stock's up here, but it's still, guys, look, this is what I'm talking about. It's still in a trading range here right around the VWAP. Now, this will ultimately change, but not for a while. Now, what I'm going to do is I am going to switch to a 5-minute chart so you can get a better sense of what's happening. And you really, unless you're really micro trading, which on a $175 stock is not exactly a great strategy, but you should never be looking at a 1 minute chart. Frankly, the 5-minute charts for intraday stuff is really about the tightest you should be looking. But we'll look at a 5-minute chart so we're not analyzing every single frickin' pore in the skin of this stock here. But so it's still below the VWAP. Now we're over half an hour in, so the big rotation is over and we're still below the volume weighted average price. Now we can also do this. Let's say it's 171.50. I'll go up here to the daily chart and you see these goofy lines here. The orange line here is the pivot point. That's 180.22. So this stock has never come up to this level, even now as I'm doing this video. It only hit the 50-day moving average for a cup of coffee. It did come down to this 169.36 level. It hit that. So we look at these pivot points as key indicators for where support and resistance may be. But I want to get back. I'm just showing you a few different things, but I want to get back on track here. Okay, so where are we now? We're here looking to make a trade. And also, by the way, I'm not just talking about day trading. I'm talking about for you long-term traders or people that are really looking to pick up Palantir on the cheap, but you don't know whether you're picking it up on the cheap or just at a rest stop on the way lower. People that have been trying to pick up Meta on the cheap have kind of been getting their asses handed to them, frankly. So Anyway, so right now you're looking at this. There's absolutely no day trade. The day trade is done. Now you're saying, all right, we're into Friday here. What's going on for the rest of the day? You're going to continue to look at the volume weighted average price and the time. Price, VWAP, time. Those are the things that matter. Okay, sitting here. Nothing done. Hey, there it is. We're back above the VWAP. Time to go long. Nope. Now it's time to go long. And the stock just continues to run. So what you would be doing here, let me get back to here. So this pushes above the VWAP and you get all excited. You see this momentum going up. That's all good. Now this is pausing a little bit. Still, I wouldn't look at this as confirmation that the stock's, quote, done going down, but it is above the VWAP. What does that mean? That means that right here is the average price of where all the shares were traded. And so this stock is up above this level just slightly, like 0.25%. So on average, this stock right now is profitable for the day because the average price is here. Now, a lot of people, got their clocks cleaned early, but over time, you can see how it all averages out. This moving average smooths, and then now the stock, by now, again, these are 5-minute bars, so like 20 minutes later, you're looking at this. Again, day trade's over. Everybody's out to lunch. Nobody's doing much of anything. You can see the volume is a little bit certainly lower than it was here. But now we're looking to see whether this stock has actually stopped going down to a point where we can rely on a bounce off the 50-day moving average. And that 50-day moving average right now is at, let's get that, 50-day moving average is 177.71. So we want to know whether this stock has a chance of getting back above the 50-day moving average. So it's looking good so far. Nothing that I'm going to do. Now it's running up higher. So now I would say this morning sell-off is definitely over. Now we've got buyers coming in. How much? Well, we need to see the momentum indicator continue to run. We need to see volume continue to tick higher. So we're watching this. Again, we're looking at the close, 1:15. That's 3 hours and 45 minutes left to go. Look at the 8-period moving average. That's the maroon line there. Flat a little bit. Well, but it's 2 o'clock. Nothing really going on, but hope springs eternal as the stock drifts sideways. Remember what that level is. Remember what that 50-day moving average level is. That 50-day moving average is 177.71. So we'll say it's 178. All right? So the stock still has to go up to here before it hits that, before it tests that 50-day moving average. Oh, here we go. Now, it's 235. We get a pop here, high volume. This is new buyers coming in. This is going to run a bit. Here we go. Continues to go. And now, where are we? We're right here. This is where the stock is pulled back to. What has it done? At the very high of the day, it's at 178.62. Okay? Now, where's the 50-day moving average? Different chart. 177.71. So this pushed up against the 50-day moving average, but has not held that level. So what's our takeaway from here? Okay, a couple. First of all, just because you happen to have a favorite stock, whether it's Palantir, Nvidia, or anything else, it's the chart that matters, not the ticker. And so what I've shown you here in looking at this is that you could have been brought into this stock, sucked into this stock on the upside, on the downside, buy here, sell here, buy here, sell here. But then when you look at it in detail, there really wasn't much going on. But hey, man, a lot of shares were bought here. A lot of shares were sold here. Nobody had an advantage. It was basically, if you're just sitting here trying to make money, it was a waste of time. So when you use this type of analysis, you can get a feel for the stock. And this isn't just for day trading. This is some knowledge. This is some experience that you need in order to get in larger trades for longer positions at the right time. There's few things that are more frustrating. There are some, but there are few things that are more frustrating than getting in at the right stock at the wrong time, because then you're just sitting there or watching it go lower. So we want to be looking at this type of thing, the VWAP, the pivot points, the momentum, the volume, early in the morning to decide whether there's a trade there. Now, if there's not, fine. Then you wait for the stock to start trading in the afternoon, because the deal is the institutions are what control the afternoon. It's them cleaning up their buy and sell orders, especially on Fridays. Friday afternoons, you can tell a lot about the demand of a stock or for a stock based on what institutions are doing. And right now, frankly, as I look at Palantir in the afternoon, still below the 50-day moving average, I don't see a lot of overwhelming demand for Palantir. It's not to say that it's not going to happen on Monday, but what this does tell me is there is absolutely, if I'm looking to buy Palantir, maybe I'm a Palantirian, I'm a fanboy, I love Peter Thiel, I just think this is awesome, I got to get into this stock. Hey, I can rest for the weekend because there's not a darn thing that's going to happen between now and Monday that's going to make me feel like I had an advantage in getting in on Friday. So, and by the way, it's taken me a long time to record this video. It would take me about 30 seconds to make this analysis without having to talk about it. And why? Because you look at this stuff enough times, you kind of have some general rules, some general guideposts or guidelines as far as what you're doing. And then all you have to do is just do it. Now, what about Nvidia? Guess what? It's kind of giving us the same exact thing. Trying to get above the VWAP, fell back down, no joy, comes up here in the afternoon around 12:30, fritters around here. Now it's up, what, a big whopping 2.5% from that. Now, that's nothing to sneeze at least I wouldn't, okay? But this is actually a better indication of a setup for, hey, maybe this can pop on Monday. Palantir, not so much, not yet, because this hasn't surpassed the 50-day moving average. This one has. So you can see this pullback below the 50 has been completely rejected by the bulls. Palantir, still working on it. So anyway, I hope this helps. Again, on Palantir, there's no urgency to buy this today. It's not like you're missing an awesome opportunity. There's just not that much appetite by institutions for this stock, at least not right now. Nvidia, kind of a different situation. This is known as a hammer, as in hammering out a base. And so you can actually expect, I don't know the magnitude of this, but you can expect this kind of move. You can expect this low today of 178.91 here. That low today is likely to be the low for quite a while. And I'm going to set an alert there just to trigger in case I'm wrong. So anyway, that's it. Now, one other thing that I was going to mention to you, we've got Cyber Monday and Black Friday coming up. And the reason I explain it that way is we're flipping it on its head, and we're going to do Cyber Monday before Black Friday. And one of the things that I'm going to be putting on special at a real special price is the 59-minute trader. This is something that I just recorded less than a year ago. It's got a lot of things in there that are different and better than the original classes. I've taught this 2 or 3 times prior to the last one. And so I'm going to be putting that on special. Do not buy it between now and then, because you'll be able to get it for less money then. And also, as kind of a bonus, I guess you could say, for anybody who invests in this course, I'm going to be doing a follow-up live session on a day when I really feel like we're going to be able to make some money. My goal, not a guarantee, but my goal is that we can make the money back that you spend on the course just by day trading on one day. So anyway, and that'll be unique to people that buy. So if one person buys, hey baby, it's you and me. If 100 people buys, well, then you can join with 99 of your closest friends. So anyway, that's that, and I'll see you all next time.